welcome back to the Nonprofit Leadership Studio. Hope you guys are doing well. We have a great guest tonight. Angela Seaworth's here with us. And Angela, how you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here with you and all of your students.
Yeah, and before the class started, it was like a mad scramble, right, to make sure we have your correct title, because you're teaching at Notre Dame, you're teaching all over these places.
Yes.
You consult, you do all sorts of really interesting things. But so your claim to fame, right, is you ran the nonprofit program at Rice for many years.
Absolutely. Here in town, that's what I did. As I was finishing my PhD at the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy, I had finished with all my academic work, and that's when it came along, the opportunity where Rice said, would you like to start a center here? And I was thrilled to be able to do that. So I was there almost 7 years and was able to, it's something that I feel is one of the most rewarding things I've done in my career. Is I hope that, Houston's been good to me and my family, and I hope that's something that maybe I was able to give back to the city.
Yeah, absolutely.
So,
and Rice I worked at Rice for 8 years. It's a wonderful place to be, so I'm glad you were able to be out there. So when we look at the world of nonprofits, Angela, and let's say that you're writing a book on fundraising, what are some of the key chapters for you around fundraising?
Planning and strategy matters. Because I think that we get so caught up in what we're doing in our day-to-day that we forget if we take the time to plan, then the rest of the year goes well. And I like to give that example of working in a school model, which I know is a little different for us in social service agencies and other places, but you find that time of the year, at the end of your fiscal year, take 2 weeks. And not for vacation. Take the 2 weeks, wrap up the year before, do the analysis, do the planning. So then when you're ready to really kick off that next month, you've got your year planned. And then if you do that, you can spend the time building relationships you need with your donors. So that's one of the first things. Another thing would probably be professionalism matters, is that to help people understand that what we do is really a profession. And I can't tell you how, and I'm sure you've run across it, but how many times when I was working at the center at Rice and trying to launch that for the city, and how many times people said, did you get paid to do this? Their careers? You mean people really will pay for training? Yes. It's a huge part of our GDP in our country. It's a huge part of our workforce. We need to be recognized as professionals. I think the other one, maybe the ask is not about you. That might be a good chapter.
Oh, yeah. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think people get afraid to ask, and I'm not immune to it. I'm actually just going into a role now where I'm going to be asking more than I have in a long time, instead of training people to ask. But I think we get nervous because we start to think it has something to do with ourselves, and that you're going to be rejected with a no, when in fact what our job is to facilitate this exchange of values. And if I'm talking to you about something you're not interested in, it's my role to listen and present you with the right opportunity. And that if you can step outside and realize that this isn't me putting myself out for everyone to say, no, I don't want to give you $500,000, but instead, it's not right now, or it's my job just to present the mission of the organization and try and find a fit so somebody can feel good about what they're doing with their philanthropic efforts. Stepping out of that, I think, really helps people. So there's that, and then probably the last big one, if I would have, would be that you can't say thank you enough. So I think we fall down on stewardship.
Stewardship is a big deal, isn't it?
It is.
And it's interesting, stewardship is maybe the easiest part of development in some ways, right? Because you already have someone who's given money. But it seems to be, I find it's one of the areas that people fall short of quite often.
Absolutely, and I think it comes down to time and the fact that we're often very stretched with the goals that we have to reach. So instead of thinking about the overall process, we're thinking about the next ask, the next ask, the next ask. Yet your best donors are people who have already given to you, right?
That's right.
So you need to think about donor retention. You need to think about the authenticity behind the thank you, right? And so if you do that, you're naturally building the relationship, and it's going to be so much easier to get them to come, to stay on board with you as a donor.
What's the best way to say thank you, do you think? Over time, right? What is the best way?
Over time, wow, I love the in-person, but sometimes we can't get there. And I do think that's why stewardship charts matter, to be able to make sure that we're doing things that are appropriate for the level of gift. And then once you get with a major donor.
Explain what that is, sort of the idea that no matter, depending upon how much you give, that sort of you get a varied amount of time spent with you, right?
Absolutely, and some people think that this is so cold. And I was actually just teaching this with my students at Notre Dame the other day, and I was explaining to them, because they're all very much, we had talked about the relationship and how important it is. And I said, if you use these tools, these techniques behind the scene that other people don't see, then you have more time to work on the relationship, and you make sure you don't miss anyone. So essentially the way I like to build them is to list all of the giving categories, giving levels down one side, and then all the things you can do to say thank you across the top. It's as simple as a spreadsheet. And then put X's in those boxes. And so you make sure, one of the last shops that I ran, every Monday morning, it was one staff member's job to pull our gifts from the last week and then sort them by giving levels and assign them, because we had worked out who was supposed to do what on our stewardship chart. And if they were supposed to get a handwritten thank you note from the Director of Annual Giving, that's one thing. If they were supposed to get an email from me or a call from me or an email from our president, that's what we had scoped out, and we made sure every Monday by noon we had that, and we knew within a week, and would like to do it a little sooner, but it was a fairly small shop, but within a week we knew that we had checked off that and we didn't miss anyone. But if that's something, if somebody walked in your office and saw, if a donor came in and saw it, it would seem very calculating and cold, but it really has the opposite effect.
Yeah.
So that's why I think it's so important.
I've been to small shops, and I'm sure you have too, where they say every donor gives a call. And I always love that, especially for a small shop that has the ability to do that. The idea that there's immediate stewardship as well, and maybe not enough places do that.
Absolutely. And I think there's a point where, on that stewardship chart, and outside of that, when you open the mail, you're like, oh, we have to call and say thank you to this person. Somebody who's really increased their gift, or someone who surprised you. And that's one thing that I love about annual giving, and that's where I started my fundraising career. And I think, and I tell everyone that they should be in a good annual giving shop, because you learn all the skills that you need outside of planned giving and the legal piece and annual fund. You can, if you're really trying, you can learn all the skills that you need. And it allows you to start identifying donors and allowing donors to identify themselves. And so when you send out a mailing to future donors and you get a $5,000 check, sure, you're going to pick up the phone and call and say, thank you so much. What inspired you to give this? And then you start building those relationships naturally. But, the ask is something that you have to be comfortable with doing. The thank you, like you said, it's the easiest part. So let's make sure and we take time for it. And it's a lot easier to come back and ask. And some of the research Penelope Burke has done around stewardship is terrific. That over 90% of donors say that an organization never contacts them unless they want money. And it's so easy to say thank you. Let's make sure our donors feel appreciated.
Even in our organization, at one point a couple of years ago, we were wondering, we were working so hard and we were raising a lot of money, but we had a local consulting firm, Dini Spheres, come in and to do an analysis. And they said, well, you guys are getting a lot of first and second time gifts, but you're not doing enough stewardship. You're not getting enough third and fourth, because
they're falling off.
No one's thanking these people. And it was sort of it was an eye opener for us, I think. Let me ask you, let's sort of the beginning of your career, and where did you grow up, Angela?
Sure, I grew up in southeastern Ohio, a tiny little town on the river, the Ohio and Muskingum River meet. And so we had to actually go across the river to West Virginia, to Parkersburg, to go shopping. Wow. It was the closest, because Parkersburg's the second largest city in West Virginia.
Wow.
And otherwise it was a 2-hour drive.
Not many large cities, right?
Exactly. So, exactly. But it's kind of funny when you say you have to go across the river to West Virginia to shop. But we were 2 hours from Columbus. So it was like basically 4 hours south from Cleveland, 4 hours east of Cincinnati. So we still have to say 4 hours from anywhere you know of. But it was a lovely place. There's a small liberal arts college there, and my parents went there and stayed.
What's the small liberal arts?
Marietta College.
Oh, Marietta.
And they're actually they have a strong petroleum engineering program.
Wow.
So I moved here to Houston, and I was like, what? People have heard of Marietta? Why? And that's why.
Yeah, because of that. And did you get a sense early on that you wanted to be in the nonprofit world, or where did that start to develop for you?
Thank you so much for letting me share this story, because it's something I want students to know. And I share it with a lot of folks. When I was an undergrad, like most of us,
went to Denison.
Went to Denison for undergraduate, and I didn't know what I wanted to do. So I realized that psychology and communication, that's what my undergrad double major was, because no matter what I did, I'd be communicating with people, right? So those skills would be a foundation. But I was student body president, and one of the trustees that I wasn't really, assigned to, came over one day and said, "Oh, I used to have your job. That was hard. Let me take you to dinner." And I had the most amazing conversation with him, because you know, at that time, I'm really dating myself if I say that, but there were no nonprofit master's programs.
Right.
You know, my PhD program's only 12 years old.
It's a relatively new phenomenon.
So it is. And so nobody had even talked to me about nonprofits, and I hadn't thought of it. But we had this incredible life-changing conversation, and I was too afraid to ask him his name. I was 20 years old. I just didn't want to get in trouble. Yeah, I was. Oh. I didn't want to get in trouble. You know,
so
in trouble with the president.
So you still to this day, do you know?
I do. That's the kicker.
Okay, good.
So he asked he's like, you're so passionate about nonprofits and service and education. Have you ever considered a career in higher ed or nonprofits? And I've been in education almost my entire career. And I was like, no, I'm going to the University of Chicago for business school, and you know, I want to major in marketing. I didn't even know it was called concentration. So the next morning I asked who he was, to the board member I was assigned to. And he's like, oh no, what did he do to you? Did he grill you? And I go, no, he bought me dinner. He's so nice. And turns out his name was Bill Bowen. He just passed away last fall. And he was president of Princeton for 16 years and president of the Mellon Foundation in New York.
Wow.
So when I found out who he was the next day, besides going, I just told this guy who's devoted his life to some amazing institutions that I'd rather market toothpaste than do what he does. Luckily, I thought about it. And I didn't do it. He gave me some wonderful advice. He said, wait 5 years before you go back to business school. And I did. But I decided to work in corporate public affairs. I wasn't quite sold on the nonprofit yet. And during that time, I had a wonderful vice president of operations. They knew that I had 5 years to go back for my fellowship for graduate school. And so I started serving on boards. And that is when I developed, because my doctoral research is on board governance. Oh, wow. And that's where that interest really developed, because I was 22, 23-year-old psychology and communication major, and I was serving on 5 boards. And because it was a small city, we were the largest corporate donor. And I got to see I got to see a lot of stuff. And some boards run very well,
and who were
some
you working
not.
for at the time?
At the time it was State Farm Insurance. And they had a really advanced public affairs department at that time, and I'm not sure how they're doing now, but you know, volunteer management database. We were letting volunteers, you know, volunteer on the clock, which was one of the first companies to do that. So it was a really neat opportunity. But when I went into rooms and I'd say, the financials don't add up. And I'm a psychology communication major, and at that age, I was unafraid to ask the question, right? And that's a meeting I'll never forget. When I asked that question, they'd been dancing around some stuff for a couple months. And here's the new person who comes in and says,
catches everything
this doesn't
right
make
there.
sense. Can somebody explain this to me?
Yeah.
So that was wonderful. So that was how I got into the nonprofit sector. I started really enjoying it. I loved what they did.
But you still went to business school.
I did. And I went there with the intent of wanting to use business in nonprofits. So the year I transitioned out, I was a loan executive for the United Way. And that person who was the executive director in Newark, Ohio, had a CFRE on her wall. And I said, what's that? One day, and she's like, oh, if you want to be an executive director of a nonprofit, you need to learn how to raise money. So I looked at it and looked into it. So decided when I went to the University of Chicago, I worked there, and I decided to get a job in the development office, because 50% tuition remission.
Ah, yes.
I had a fellowship, but it didn't come with money. So I had guaranteed admission, and so I did my first almost 3 years of fundraising work at the University of Chicago. And
not a bad place to start.
No, right? I'm very grateful for that experience, for sure. And one of the things, I was there for about a year in the business school, was where I started, and they recruited me to come over because they found out they had an MBA student with a background for with marketing and strategy. So they asked me to come over and they created a position called like the Associate Director of Strategy and Participation. So my job was to go around, and they had decentralized their annual fund, and they wanted to bring it all back in-house. So I had to go around, and again, because this is how it just made sense, and I didn't know any better as we learn things, and we're bold when we're young, right? So I developed an annual giving plan for every single college, and went out and pitched to every dean and development officer to try and get them to trust us to bring it back in-house. And so I did that for 3 years.
Did they all like it?
And most of them.
Most of them did, yeah.
You know, most of them, because we were able to justify that we could be of value, we could deliver better than a vendor could. But what I didn't know is when I moved here, and after my husband and I graduated, we moved here and got married. And, you know, I didn't realize people started asking me, treating me like an annual giving expert. And I was like, why? I've only done like 70 of these things. They're like, okay, it's annual. I think it was Ann Murphy who actually said that. She's like, it's annual. Most of us don't do 70. You already have. But I was like, oh, okay, I can teach that course. So I'm so grateful for Dr. Bowen, because he's the person who connected the dots for me, that you could use your passion, your skill sets, connect that with your passion and make a difference in the world. And I've had some really amazing mentors there, and also in my doctoral program that has helped me make the decisions I've made lately.
Wow. And what brought you to Houston initially? Was it just, coincidence or what?
Yeah, we didn't know anyone in Houston.
Yeah.
And I knew I wanted to be in the nonprofit sector, and my fiance at the time had offers in 5 cities. And we had no idea where we wanted to go, so we were complete nerds about it. We did a weighted average on things that mattered to us.
Yeah.
And Houston came out on top, 3 different ways we rated it.
Yeah.
So we said, guess we're moving to Houston. So we came with a 3-year plan, like many people will say, and planning to go back to the Midwest where our family is.
Right, yeah.
And we've been here 18 years.
Yeah.
And
I moved here from Columbia University to Rice University exactly the same way, that I was going to be here for just a couple of years and then move elsewhere. And I'm still waiting, right? So
that's right. And so we're really pleased with that decision. And like I said, the city's been good to us, and that's part of why I was so happy because it's not very often that you can build something that you feel like benefits the city, right? And so I felt like that was an opportunity to do that at Rice, and it felt really good and rewarding to do that, thinking that just during my time we trained nearly 5,000 people, and so I kind of felt like, this is good now that it's my adopted home.
Yeah.
To be able to say thank you in
your
that way.
Your kids are Houstonians, right?
They are. Both my kids are Texans, and my daughter has a real twang. We're not sure how she got that, but she's
not
all
from
Texan.
You and your husband, right?
No, not with our Chicago accent.
Let me ask you just a couple of questions about the ask. Right now, students are reading in the text a little bit around asking and major gifts, especially. Talk to me a little bit about sort of all the pre-steps before an ask, because I think when you ask sort of a common person on the street about an ask, they think it's a cold call. But so often, the thing that's a cold call is not going to be successful. There's actually a whole art to getting up to that point where it is successful.
Absolutely. And there are a couple things that I would say about that. First, that's where the research comes into play. You have to know who you're talking with. And we've actually destroyed one of Aristotle's quotes in fundraising, right? Or we say, where he's written it eloquently and beautifully, and we've taken it for our own profession to say fundraising's easy as long as you ask the right person for the right amount at the right time, and the right project.
Yeah.
So that's what it's about, is making sure you're aligning interest. And if not aligning interest, at least making sure that you have the right people in front of it. So I think there are a couple things. You have to know what, you have to have somebody who has not just capacity, but also an inclination or, engagement in your institution, or at least with what you're doing. And just go get to know them, share, this is what we're doing. See how they're interested. That's part of it, is listening. Yeah. Well, on that first meeting, you're not going to go into a first meeting and ask for $500,000 or $100,000. To go in and just find out really where they are. What do you care about? What are you looking at now with your philanthropy? What are some things that you like to do if you give to a particular, say somebody in town gives to faith-based institutions? Well, there are a lot of ways to do that. So find out where their heart is. Do they like to give to faith-based institutions that support children or families or women? Find that out. Healthcare. There are so many different ways. So we find that out, and then we also start finding out who they know at our institution. How do we have a connection with them personally? That's often what gets us the first meeting. But to be able to make sure when it's time for the ask that you put the right person in front of them, and it's not always the CEO. Right. And it's rarely the development officer, but I'm a strong proponent that the development officer should be there just to help move things along.
Right.
In case, there's some CEOs that are comfortable enough and they're so good sharing their story that I don't want to be there because I don't want to be in the way. But particularly somebody who's not really comfortable asking, or if you're having a volunteer do it and they haven't asked a lot, to go in as a team, knowing that we're there just as a backstop, sort of, in case there's anything we can do to move them along. Or answer any questions that they don't have, because the last thing you want to do is send someone in who's unprepared to answer a question.
And how many visits on average would you say it takes before you get to that point? So how many visits does a prospective donor get before you get to the point where maybe, and I know it's going to be different with everyone, right?
It is,
but
it's
in general.
Hard. I mean, I've known folks that have waited 4 or 5 years, and I've known people that have closed gifts in two visits.
Yeah.
So
But see, that's the point I think I want to make, though, is that it doesn't happen on that first visit, right?
no,
There's always a couple of visits before you make that ask.
absolutely. There has to be. They have to get to know who you are. And for example, if you're launching a new initiative, what do? You have to launch it. You have to get out and talk to people, and then see who come. If you have a reception, see the 6 people that come up and talk to you afterward. They're going to be the first 6 people you go have an individual meeting with, and ask for their advice. And the old adage in fundraising, right? If you want money, ask for advice. If you want, and if you want it.
Yeah.
So you have to play that.
But
in the
that's
right
a good
way.
little hint, right? I mean, that a lot of times people don't know that whole idea of I need your help. I want to ask your advice on this, right?
Yeah, that's what
always
often
a
leads to gifts.
Yeah.
Because they buy into the, and they know that you really do care about what they're thinking. It shouldn't just be, a transparent tool that you want to say, I'd like your advice, and can you have, will you
I'd
be
like
willing
your
to
advice
consider
on how
this?
do I ask you for $1 million? Could you give me advice on that?
Exactly. Here's
So-
the packet we've already prepared because I was planning to ask you anyway. So I think the whole notion of philanthropy with me goes back to voluntary action for the public good and Mr. Payton's definition for that. I mean, I'm a strong believer and I love him. And I try and help people understand that. And if you're understanding, there are only so many things you can control in an ask. It's up to the donor. It's their voluntary action for something to help or support something that they care about and for something that they think is going to be good for the public. Then you can look at it. I have a graph that I use or a chart I use often when I teach, and it shows the imbalance. Like, here are the things you can't control. You can't control if they're going to say yes, and you can't control when they're going to say yes. But look at all these things you can control.
Yeah.
We can control if we take them the right project, if we put the right people in front of them, if we've done our homework, if we've answered all their questions.
Yeah. The other thing, and so many people that have sat in this chair talk about this idea about listening, right?
Yeah.
So it's so important to really just listen to the people you're talking with and that you're visiting with, because they will often tell you what they're going to do for you.
Absolutely. And that's hard, especially when you're new at this.
Yeah.
And I'm a little nervous. Like I said, I'm going to be asking more than I have in a while. And I'm going to have to remember that I'm not going in to sell. And I think that's a mistake we make. It's like, look at this great new initiative. We're going to do this and this and this and this and this. And like, let me prove ourselves to you, as opposed to going in saying, hey, thanks so much for taking time to visit with us. How are you? You do the small talk and say, well, yeah, this is an initiative we thought you might be interested in. If I can tell you a little bit about it, maybe you could react.
Yeah. How do you do, you go in with the CEO, and so I think of my director of development going in with me. I'm often super enthusiastic, right? And I want to talk about things and show the passion. I mean, I'm going to talk about some of this stuff around children. How do you, as a director of development, sort of get it to the point where the CEO maybe needs to settle down and we need to listen a little bit? How do you get there?
We try and train before we go in and then have cues in the meeting.
Oh, you have cues. What's an example of a cue?
So it depends on how you have to work it out with each other. But, it could be like if I pull my folder out and put it on the desk, then that's enough. Or if I close my folder, then, you got to stop and we need to move on. So you have to work that out so you have a good relationship with your CEO, because that is very natural. And, it was really fun when I was out doing some fundraising for the center. That was the first time I was presenting the program instead of being the fundraiser. And I took my development officer with me. And it was really interesting on the drive over, being prepped and told, okay, now we're going to take notes and I'm going to do this. And I was like, oh yeah, that is what we're supposed to do. Because I was thinking, I can't wait to tell this person about all the incredible things. We have 30 classes now. We've got certificates. We've done so much with, with such a tiny amount of funding, and this is what we'd do with their money. And that's where my head was. So I think you have to understand that with the leader of your institution, that like you said, that's where your excitement and energy is. So you have to be able to rein them in. And, sometimes, it's good to practice before you go in. And one of my favorite donor stories is we went to a donor in town, and who shall remain nameless, but is very difficult to work with sometimes. Every while, at least that's the facade, right? As that, this person's never going to tell you yes before you leave. And very difficult. You have to jump through a lot of hoops. And so we were ready, but I took this gentleman's best friend and his pastor on a call. And so both leading huge organizations. And I asked them to rehearse. And I was very young, again, one of those things you do because you read it in a textbook and you don't think this CEO and
they did it. They
pastor of a
rehearsed with
mega church would be offended. They rehearsed, And it was so good that they did, because they just needed to be able, I was like, clearly you guys are both amazing fundraisers and have so much more experience than me, but we know this about the donor.
Yeah.
You guys know that about him. And both of your personal relationships could kind of take over. So it might be good for us just to have a 15-minute call and kind of see how we're going to pass this back and forth between the two of you, and I'll just be there to answer questions.
And it worked out pretty well.
And we left, and we actually had the gift. We had $500,000 before we left. Said yes.
Wow.
Now, would I have gotten the gift on my own, or if I'd taken my CEO? No way.
Yeah.
But you can't always get somebody's pastor to go in and do that with you, and best friend.
What a nice thing.
So it was, but the institution needed it, and both of the gentlemen knew that. So they prepared, and they wanted to be respectful of him. And I thought that was a really good lesson for me to learn. I was like 28, I think. It was a good lesson for me to learn that these board members wanted to, even though they had such a close relationship with this person, they wanted to be respectful, and they wanted to go through the steps of preparing to give him a good presentation, as opposed to just saying, come on, we're buddies. You know you're going to ask me for this back someday. It was very thoughtful and well done, and we got the yes and a significant gift on that way out.
$500,000 is significant, I will say. So you're ready for a couple of questions from the Twitterverse? So
Sure,
students are tweeting in as we speak. Here's some of these are questions. So Latanya Julian wants to know how many contacts you make with a donor before asking for a gift. That's our other question. So anywhere between 2 and 5. I mean, it's
If you're going too many beyond 5, it better be for a large gift. Otherwise, they're signaling they're probably not ready. You need to maybe listen a little bit more.
I always think also that donors know why you're meeting with them. They know that you're eventually going to ask for money.
Right.
But they so appreciate it when you're visiting with them, and they certainly appreciate a first or second visit when you're just visiting, right?
Right.
That I think they like that you didn't ask for money. And many times they will say, I mean, I'm sort of surprised sometimes, like, well, how much money would you, how much would you like to ask before? I think it's sort of an odd thing sometimes, right?
Right. And sometimes I wonder about that, because it's like, well, I don't want to waste your time, but do you want to think about it a little more? Or let us go back after what I've heard today. Let's go back and put together a package for you. Mm-hmm. And then we can give you, because I am a huge believer in you give people options.
Yeah.
And rather than, will you give us this specific amount, say, would love for you to support us. Could it be this range to this range? Or give them 2 different things from what we've talked about with you and your wife. What would you like to, what would your family like to do? And let them think about it and get back. I mean, you're not going to offer something that you don't need. And it gives them, I think, a firm understanding that you've listened to them, and that you're trying to be careful with with your relationship and how you ask.
Milton Guardado has a great question that you and I have faced many times.
Okay.
And he's asking, do you need to make a grand presentation, a PowerPoint, video? You remember the days when people thought you need to have a DVD to do some sort of presentation? And I'm like, oh, come on, you don't need. Yeah. But that whole idea, people often believe they need a grand presentation. Talk a little bit about that.
That's interesting. I don't think you do.
Yeah,
I think you need passion.
Yeah.
Because nobody wants you to pull up in their office and sit down and set up all this stuff.
How boring is that, right?
And it's awkward. So instead, you share your passion for what you're doing. Yeah. Now, if it's complicated, it does help to have some slides.
Yeah.
And the other thing is, I like to actually just have it printed out and have a packet.
Right.
So 1, you could leave it with them. But 2,
and big enough that they can read, right?
Absolutely. No 8-point font.
Yeah.
And the fact is, you don't want to rely on technology like not working in the middle of your ask.
Right.
I mean, it's rare, but that's a terrible thing. So no, and the other thing that another example I use for that is with annual fund, for example. There was an institution in town about probably 10 years ago now. They had this really expensive annual giving mailer, and it had a lock on the front, and you had to spin it and get it open. And I couldn't, it was a paper lock, but still you had to do that. Yeah. And I was like, oh my goodness, that had to have cost $4 or $5 per, when that institution had such a strong reputation anyway. They could have sent it out on plain white paper.
And it would have been fine.
And it would have been just fine. Yeah. So I always try and tell people is, donors don't want you to waste money. You don't need to try and impress them, because they've seen every glossy presentation out there. Just be professional.
Mm-hmm. Very good. This is a good one. Leslie Azalia wants to know, if you're just starting off, new nonprofit, how do you identify donors? How do you start building a donor base? How do you get perspectives?
That's interesting, right? Yeah. You have to start with your inner circle. Yeah. And I try and remind people to use a concentric circle and think about who's closest to you. Mm-hmm. Who are your clients, who you're serving, your staff, your board members. Who are you impacting? You impacting your community, and move forward. I think I said I've never worked in a social service agency, so it's harder for me to give those examples because we have built-in constituencies in education, which is where I've spent most of my career.
Yeah.
But I do think that there are, you certainly can buy mailing lists that make sense. A student that I'm working with right now, they have tried to approach people who have adopted animals throughout the area, because apparently they can buy a mailing list of people who have adopted animals.
Yeah.
And so they don't have to have anything to do with their organization, but they know because they've adopted animals, they care about their organization. So that's one of the mailing lists that they buy. So you can be careful, you can do that, but it's a lot easier when you have a building constituency for sure.
I always I've heard a number of people talk about this strategy, and I haven't done this very much though I've taken pictures, like when you visit other organizations that are like yours, and sometimes they have the big donor wall.
Oh, absolutely.
Take pictures, or going online, it's some of the people organizations like yours, who are their donors, because they are possible donors for you as well.
Absolutely. That's why I always laugh and say that you always know who the fundraisers are when you leave the theater district, because they're the ones that have like 4 playbills with them on the way out because they're taking them back to their research team. It's true, right?
No, that's right.
And even my kids, because they've been with me, I had both of them in the doctoral program. So their whole lives, I'd like to think I'm teaching about generosity, but they've been in the philanthro world.
Yeah.
And so they go into museums now, or whenever we go into a donor wall, they stop and look at it. So it's because that's what mommy does. We go in and we're like, oh yeah, look at those folks.
Excellent.
And that's a tip that I have. I had one president that didn't want to do this, but I'll share it with you guys because I've taken it at the ACFRE level and the board, and they think it's a good idea for training folks. But I say, if you have a new CEO in town, one of the best things you can do to acclimate them is to take them to an interesting museum, someplace that they could use to have small talk. As they're getting used to people saying, oh, did you know about the whatever exhibit, or just as they're warming up. But the other reason is because you can practice like working across the room from each other, like if you're working on signals, just by standing across the room and having noise and being able to learn to speak to each other with the noise level in the room.
Oh, wow.
I think those are things that you can learn there, but then also you show them the donor wall, and you stand in front of the donor wall for an hour and say, this family does this family does this one, no, forget that, you're gonna hear their name, but they don't care about anything that we do, so don't worry about it. And then I think there's so much you can learn by doing this. So I had one president didn't want to do it with me, but that's okay.
Well, it's better than going to the foundation directory. I mean, really, it's sort of more visual and more interesting, right?
Absolutely, and you get to practice that, when you're first starting, and even if it's not a new president in town, if it's just the first time you're working together with a DO, and if you're going to be working a lot of major events, you have to learn to talk to each other where there's a noise level, and to be able to have subtle cues with one another, not like, hey, so-and-so wants, come over here. You've got to be able to figure out that when you do this, or if you do this, or whatever, that the other person needs to react.
Okay, so here's Rocio Moreno wants to know, what's the most important advice that you would give a student studying nonprofit management? Do you have a piece of advice, Angela? Angela, you have a lot of good advice, though, right?
Oh, nice. I think is to remember the nobility behind what you're doing and take it very seriously.
Yeah.
Because if you're called to be in the nonprofit sector, there are a lot of people who don't understand what we do.
Yeah.
And there'll be people who talk about fundraising as begging, and we still have to educate them. So my advice is that you really authentically commit to what you're doing. And the other thing that I always tell people is to uplift each other in the nonprofit sector, because we all do hard work and we often can't talk about it outside of. And so you need to have a good network of people that you treat well and that you can rely on. And I think we have to build that support network. And that was something I tried to teach all of our students that came through at Rice, is we have to be there for each other, because we're our own network and our own, the foundation of the nonprofit infrastructure, right?
Yeah.
That's my piece.
Yeah. So I'm getting a number of questions from students on either what's your most profitable fundraising event, or what's your most successful fundraising experience. Do you have some sort of experience or event or something that's your big ask that you want to talk about?
Probably the one I shared already.
Yeah, okay.
I was so pleased to get that $500,000 out of the donor. Everyone said wouldn't do it, and I think it's a good example of, following the step-by-step best practices and making sure that worked. Everybody remembers their first $1 million gift. and I got a $4 million gift when I was fairly young, and I wrote the proposal for that and trained the board member and sent them on the ask themselves, and then actually had to go in and have some, surgery, and I found out the day of the ask. And so I woke up out of surgery. The board member came to the hospital with my family, and when I came out, he was sitting in my room, and he's like, "Hey, we got it."
$4 million.
$4 million. I was like,
and that's
sweet.
a good wake-up call, right? $4 million.
That
Wow.
was good. And but to let your students know as well, some of the smallest asks are really big. There's a person in town that had made his first, decided he wanted to pay tuition for an employee student, and I had to tell him how it wasn't tax deductible and things, and it was fine. And one day he came out to visit the student, and he just broke down in tears because it was the first time he had really felt like he wasn't doing social giving.
Yeah.
Like, I'm just giving because I want to go to the gala, or you
Yeah.
gave, so now I have to give. It was the first time it was really powerful and touched him. And so that's one of those moments, and I ended up going home an hour and a half, 2 hours late, because I sat with that person as they, as that individual cried and processed that feeling philanthropic for the first time. So I think we have all a range of things that matter. I felt like I helped that person like discover philanthropy.
Yeah, that's nice, right?
Yeah.
Afshan Malik wants to know, this is sort of a where do you see yourself in 10 years? That's her question. Where do you see yourself?
Sean, that's a great question. I've been really driven. I've either gone to school, I've gone to school and worked full time for about 14 years. In order to get my MBA and PhD, and I have a graduate certificate in there as well from SPIA. So for the next 7 to 10 years or so, I have 2 little kids, and I'm trying to do things that are fun, that allow me to have flexibility with my family. And it's the first time, actually this is the first time I've talked about it publicly, aside from a group of students at Texas A&M, that my career's not taking a back step, by any means, but I'm doing things that really speak to me and putting my family first. And when my kids are in college, I can go full steam ahead and get back on the path I was originally trained, in my doctoral program to maybe be a liberal arts college president, who knows. But at this point in my life, I want to be with my kids. And I don't think enough women talk about it. I'm not a big lean-in person. I think that, I think instead you do your best and you're aggressive and you do what you want to do. I don't think there's something that we have to sacrifice in order to be successful in our careers. I think we need to find meaning, and that's what's going to allow us to be more successful. I never felt like I worked at Rice when I was building the center, and those were long hours and hard hours, and people said it couldn't be done here in town. So I felt like for the first couple of years, I felt like I had a lot of pressure pushing down, and certainly a lot of people looking. And I felt that pressure, but because I believed in it so deeply, it didn't feel like I was working. But I had an infant, and I had a 3-year-old and an infant during that time. So now I want to slow down and take time to balance that. So I'm not sure where I'll be in 10 years. And it's funny because I was somebody who always had a 3 to 5 year plan, and going to school and working at the same time. I mean, it was very scoped out. And I'm so happy with what I'm doing now, teaching with 3 universities, helping with this program a little bit.
You are.
Being able to do that brings me such joy. I had some consulting contracts, have decided to go in, as I shared with you earlier, with a small startup organization that allows me a lot of time and really believes family, doesn't just talk about, believes in it. So that's where I am right now. And some people think it's interesting. Some of my professors are confounded. For my doctoral program, they're like, "What are you doing?" I'm like,
well, because you're a very driven person, right? I mean, so
absolutely.
So for you to say a little bit of a step back, right? Focusing on family, still pretty active, but it's a tough thing. And many times I'll ask people, question on work-life balance, and it's interesting that a lot of driven people sort of laugh at that question, like, "Well, I have no work-life balance," but you're sort of taking this sort of intentional step around this.
Absolutely, and it came from my doctoral program. My advisor was the chancellor of the IUPUI campus.
Explain IUPUI.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, that's hard. IUPUI. It's Indiana University, Purdue University. They have a campus in Indianapolis that's merged, but that's where the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy is. And he was chancellor when they approved that program, and I was so fortunate to get to work with him. When I became pregnant in my doctoral program, I told my female professor, and I was like, "I'm sorry if I may have to step out. I don't know. I just found this out. I might have morning sickness. I don't know." And she's like, "Don't worry. I won't tell anyone."
Oh, wow.
that's why I share that story, because that's very real for women who still work who work in the academy, and I have colleagues that face it. And I remember feeling, oh wow. And I went and when I told him, I was thinking, oh, because the rumors had already started. Oh, she won't finish. Well, I did.
Yeah.
But what he told me instead was, I am so happy for you and your husband. Take the full 10 years. We give you 10 years. You'll never get this time back. And I'm so grateful for that. He told me a story how he worked hard to get tenure, and then he had this romanticized idea of it, and at the end of the 7 years, like, his kids didn't want to hang out with him. So I've decided it's kind of a responsibility of mine now to tell that story, to say, I'm very intentionally working on projects that I want to work on. And I know I'm grateful because I did, if you think about career path, I mean, I did try to work very, very hard and check a lot of boxes. I mean, I have my ACFRE, you know, the master's, PhD, whatever, you know, I checked all those boxes. I hope what that does is give me the flexibility to be with my family and make a difference in my community, which are the two things I want to do right now.
Yeah.
And then as my kids are heading off to college, then I can, you know, whatever is time right for me at that time is okay, but I'll never get these 7 years back. So that's, and then I don't know, I feel a little brave saying that right now, because a lot of people wouldn't imagine that. And a lot of people in town don't know I'm doing this yet either. So, you know, it feels good to say that, because I want women to understand, because if we're still primarily women in the nonprofit sector, you know.
Yeah, no, that's right.
And I think you can have it all. We can't necessarily have it all at the same time, right? So you have to work on this work-life integration.
Yeah.
I think it's integration more than balance. So I have something now that's allowing me to be in some really amazing academic institutions, helping grow an organization that's really fun, and still have some family time.
Well, and we both know women who don't have good balance, and they just go straight for it. And sometimes that's what they really want.
Right.
But we also, I mean, I know plenty of women that have figured out a way to have the balance, right? To be very successful, but have intentionally figured out what are the things that I need to do to make sure I have time with my kids. I know fewer men like that.
Right.
But we know people, you know, we both know people like that, that have figured it out, and they're okay for their career to move maybe a little bit slower, but they have that great reward of having time with their kids.
Absolutely. And so that's why I decided to share it, because it's something that no one ever shared with me.
Yeah.
The only person, ironically, the only person who said, take time with your kids to me was a man who regretted that he didn't.
Yeah.
And, you know, that's meaningful for me right now. And I think that when we find meaning in our life and balance, then we work better, we're more creative, and we end up where we're supposed to be.
Yeah. I have a similar family story. I moved from Rice to be the dean of a college up in Amherst, Massachusetts. And my daughter at the time was in kindergarten, and my wife commuted back and forth to Houston. And my daughter was with me, you know, as soon as she came out of school, she would come to the college and she would be with me. And she was used to that time, and it was very rewarding, right, to have her with me all the time. And then I moved to be the vice president of another university. And I remember going to the basketball suite where the president, and bringing my daughter Ginny, and afterwards the president said, you know, we don't bring kids. We don't bring kids. And it was interesting, right, to see that dynamic of being at really a much more prestigious place and having my daughter with me all the time, and then going to another place that, because I wanted to be closer for my wife's commute, and to see that sort of change. And you know, I didn't stay there long, because you sort of make those decisions around your family.
And you know, and I wasn't planning to go in house somewhere. I talked to a couple organizations over the last couple months, but I picked the culture of where I'm going to be, and I wanted to be with good people and people that understood that my family mattered, and that I had the skill set. I was going to come in and deliver.
Yeah.
But I didn't want to be in a high pressure situation for something that was meaningless.
Yeah.
Because that's the worst thing you can do, is to take a job, and I've done that once, where you take a job that you think is what you should do for the next step in your career, and it's the wrong culture, it's the wrong fit. I knew it going in.
Yeah.
But I thought, well, this is what I'm supposed to do.
Yeah.
And I was miserable.
Yeah.
And it just wasn't worth it. So.
Yeah. Well, good. We've probably done more work-life balance than usual here, but let me do a couple more questions before we finish up today. Jennifer Del Pozo wants to know, when you're hiring, Angela, when you're hiring brand new fundraising professionals, what are the characteristics you're looking for?
Work ethic, integrity, authenticity. We can teach you anything else. But there are certain things that you cannot be good in this profession without, and I think that's it. You have to be willing to work hard, be curious, be intellectually curious, and really have a passion for helping an organization grow.
Yeah, Brian Green
Those
from the
kinds of
food bank, one of the things he'll often say when we talk through these things is he'll say, I could train almost everything, but I can't train integrity.
That's
So
right.
It's sort of an interesting, that you bring that up as well.
Oh, absolutely. You've got to have a strong work ethic and be a good person of integrity. If you have those two things, then I'm willing to work with a lot of other things.
Development is about the easiest position to evaluate in any organization, isn't it? How much money have you raised?
Quantitatively, yes.
Yeah, it's pretty easy to evaluate. All right. So Leslie, well, let me try someone else. Britt John wants to know creativity. How important is creativity in terms of a development plan?
That's kind of an interesting question.
Yeah, it is, isn't it?
Creativity is incredibly important in development because you're essentially solving problems all the time.
Yeah.
So you have to be creative in development. As far as a development plan, not necessarily.
Yeah.
The tried and true can work.
She goes on a plan around major gifts. Anything, creativity, can that, yeah.
To me, it doesn't speak to that.
Yeah.
The creativity in major gifts, I think, is being creative in how you align projects with people and how you work with people and solve the problems around it. But that's it. We're having a major donor reception and making sure you get an interesting, invitation and get it out on time and solve all the logistical problems to make that happen.
Let's see. I'm trying to find a good one here. Okay, so Tanya Castellano wants to know valuable lessons that your doctorate taught you, or compare doctorate, your academic versus sort of your real life experience.
Yeah, I say I'm a pracademic.
Yeah.
Because I like to do research, but I like it to be practical, and I love to still be in the world, and that was part of the reason I left Rice was, one, I felt like we'd built it as far as they wanted to go.
Yeah.
But I'd been there for almost 7 years, and I was starting to feel like I was teaching something I didn't do anymore. Right?
Yeah.
So I wanted to get back in and get on sort of the ground floor and just re-energize.
There's a lot of power in doing, isn't there?
Yes, and you learn so much. And the one thing that I think the doctorate taught me, of course, analytics, refining my analysis and analytical skills, but perseverance.
Yeah.
And I heard that before I went in, and I didn't really believe it because it's like, oh, well, I got through the master's, I got through the grad certificate. It is different. And so it taught me that because of also my mentor. I'm, again, so grateful to have worked with Dr. Bepko. He and Dr. Cochran now is my dissertation chair. They were so supportive. And we focused a lot on leadership and educational leadership. And the types of things they exposed me to that I wouldn't have had the opportunity for, I think that has changed how I manage people. So ironically, I think that one of the things I got out of my doctoral program is how to help grow professionals because of how well I was treated. And I try and take those lessons. So it's that, the resiliency and persistence. Heaven knows we need resiliency in fundraising.
Absolutely.
And part of that is, sharing your ideas, organizing and sharing your ideas, being bold enough to put it out for somebody to analyze, and then having to get that feedback and say, okay, well, we're going to try and rewrite it. Those are things that I learned. But the practical, when I teach fund development courses, I always talk about sharing our ideas because what we do is experiential, and so I could be in the field for 50 years and never have the experience you had yesterday.
Right.
And so I think the more that we can share, and so I talk so much about trying to uplift other nonprofit professionals because there's no way we can know it all.
And by and large, I think nonprofit professionals do try to uplift each other. I mean, there's always a few that don't play well with others, but by and large, most people are very supportive.
I think so, but I always just encourage that with new people coming into the field.
It's not a territorial sort of thing. It shouldn't be.
Yeah, absolutely.
When you look at the landscape of, and we'll finish up here, but when you look at the landscape of nonprofits in Houston, who are some of the thoroughbreds, some of the really overperformers that you see out there that are doing a really nice job?
In terms of fundraising specifically,
yeah.
I think Tom does a great job over at Kincaid.
Oh yeah, Kincaid, yeah.
You
Private
know,
school, yeah.
It's an independent school. I know that world. I think he does a lovely job with them, and they have. And granted, it's a bit easier when you have a constituency with capacity.
Yeah.
But you don't. What I love about it is you don't see high turnover among their staff.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of stewardship that happens.
Yeah.
They're calm. They do things the right way. I think that's one of them. We've seen our friend Kevin Foyle do really well at the hospital level, but again, I think it's because he embraces the profession and is building a team. When he has the chance to build his own team, that he's bringing in good people and again following best practices. So I think those are two of them. And I'm going to give a shout out to our friend Angie Lane too. At the ballet, because I think they've had to do some incredible stretches, and especially since Harvey came through.
Yeah,
and the
and
hurricane.
so many groups have been hurt by that.
Absolutely, and we've all done something, but I think they've really done well in cultivating. So, in cultivating and again just managing their shop. Good shops I don't look for dollar amount, but I do look for employee retention. Whether or not they invest in their professional development and their staff. And that's something that I know those organizations do.
Yeah.
They make sure their staff's involved in professional development. They treat them well. They keep them. I think to me that's the sign of a good development shop.
Yeah. So a couple of fun questions. Your favorite restaurant in town, Angela?
Oh, hands down, Chewy's.
Chewy's, right?
Yeah, it's the first restaurant we went to when we were here, and we still love it.
So
Our kids love going
imprinted.
there.
So that's
that's our go-to.
The imprint of a Mexican restaurant for you is Chewy's, right?
Well, exactly. Coming from the Midwest, we thought it was the most fantastic food we've ever had because our Midwestern food's a little bland.
So what did you have in the Midwest? You had like Taco Bell, and did you have anything else?
I'm not kidding. In my small hometown in Marietta, we got a Taco Bell. We're like, we have Mexican food, in high school. So the Tex-Mex was really amazing for us, and we lived really close by when we first were here and didn't have kids yet. So we ate there a lot more than we should have. And we thought, it's fresh food. Look at this, it's healthy.
Good
Forget the
happy hour.
queso.
They have a good happy hour there. So
it's just fun, and it's quirky and fun, and that's part of my personality. So.
And the final question: when Hollywood decides to make the Dr. Seaworth story, who's going to play you? Who do you think should play you?
Oh, I don't know. I haven't watched television in probably 12, 14 years.
Do you know some actors that may look like you? Who would you pick?
No, you know what? It's not somebody who looks like me. She's a lot taller than me, and I went to school with her. She lived across the hall from me growing up. I'll say Jennifer Garner.
Oh, wow. So you're buddies with Jennifer Garner? She's a close friend of yours?
No, it's not that. We just lived across the hall from each other freshman year. But I would say, just because I really don't watch TV and stuff much. But why not? I could be about 6 inches taller. I want somebody to be taller than me.
Is she tall?
She's a lot taller than I am, but that's about anyone.
Angela Seaworth, thank you so much for the work that you do. Thanks for being here in the class tonight.
Thank you for having me, and I really wish all of your students well, because it's such an incredible profession.
Yeah,
so I hope they enjoy being in it.
Thank you so much. That's it for the Nonprofit Leadership Studio. Thank you guys so much. Keep up the great work, and we'll see you next time.